Hey guys, tonight we wander back through the sagas, but instead of chasing after axe-swinging raiders, you slip through a carved wooden doorway into the presence of someone far more elusive, the Viking Queen. Her crown isn't glittering with diamonds, but made of woven alliances, powerful whispers, and a will strong enough to steer entire kingdoms from the shadows. You can almost smell the sweet tang of birchwood smoke from her long hall fire. Hear the murmur of her advisors. Feel the hush that follows every word she speaks. These queens, let me warn you, have more secrets stitched into their linen gowns than a whole fleet of berserkers. And if you had to go up against them, you probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments, so we can build our cozy traveling band across the centuries. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through centuries of lore where men, all iron helmets and broad shoulders, seem to stomp across every page. But if you listen carefully, behind their battle cries, you'll hear another voice, softer, colder, sometimes sharper than a spearhead. These are the voices of Viking queens, whose power lived in negotiation, prophecy, and the balancing of ambition with survival. You see her now, seated on a rough-carved oak bench, threads of teal wool catching the glow of an oil lamp, hands folded but commanding the attention of a chieftain who just returned from the sea. Historians still argue whether these queens were truly as powerful as their songs hint, or if later medieval scribes simply inflated their influence. But even those scribes could not fully erase them, try as they might. These women held court in ways you'd never find on a battlefield. They decided who slept where, who married whom, which children would inherit a sword or be trained to tend a shrine. Behind a curtain of woven tapestries, they planned how tribute would be divided, which alliances could be renewed, which could be destroyed. One mainstream historical fact is that Viking queens almost never ruled alone in name. They ruled as the wife of or mother of a king. But don't be fooled. That title could mask absolute power over household economies, political marriages, and sometimes even who lived and who died. The Queen's Longhouse was a hub of power, buzzing with news from distant trade routes, and more than one merchant trembled before a queen's steward counting out silver coins. A quirky tidbit is that some Viking queens were rumored to keep a pet hawk in the rafters of their hall, partly to show off, partly to keep guests on their best behavior. Imagine trying to negotiate a bride price while a glaring razor-taloned bird judged your every word. Your feet shift through the rough dirt floor, catching on bits of straw. The Queen's Hall feels half domestic, half sacred. On one side, pots of bubbling stews and ragged children tumbling with a dog. On the other, a hush, the place where she seats her guests of rank, where you wouldn't dare raise your voice too high. The power she holds is as much about that space as the laws written in runes. And that's the hidden truth, isn't it? These queens shape the fate of kingdoms by listening more than talking, by remembering what an oath meant, by seeing the patterns in the way a neighbor's warriors marched, or how a new Christian priest tried to win souls with bread instead of spears. When the men went off to raid or trade, she became the stabilizing force that kept everything from crumbling. You wonder for a moment what it would feel like to live under her gaze, knowing she might know the names of your grandparents, your debts, your grudges, and use them all for or against you. Because Viking justice could be harsh, but queenly politics was its own dangerous battlefield. As you lean against the cool oak beam of the doorway, you can picture how she would pause, cup of mead in hand, hearing two rival jarls shout about who owed which tribute. With a single glance, she could cool them down or turn them on each other. Control, you realize, doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it just carries a thin gold neck ring and a memory as sharp as a sword. And still, the sagas swirl around the warlike men. It takes effort to peel back those layers and find these queens. Their names are half forgotten. Gunhild, sometimes called Mother of Kings, or Thera, who built defenses strong enough to frighten even the boldest warband. Historians still argue whether these women were born to command, or if the endless chaos of the Viking Age simply demanded their rise. The scent of stewing fish and fresh-cut herbs clings to the night air, mixing with the cold snap of sea breeze. You hear a soft laugh from a young girl by the fire, dreaming of marriage, not realizing that someday she might hold the keys to an entire kingdom. And you almost want to tap her shoulder to tell her she'll need more than pretty braids to survive, in a world where every promise is a trap and every alliance a test. So, tonight you settle down near that hearth, let the flicker of the flames dance against painted shields, and breathe in the living memory of these women who ruled from behind curtains, who learned to make peace with the sharp edge of a blade always waiting in the shadows. Their stories have waited long enough to be heard, and you're ready to listen. The mead is sweet and warm on your tongue, but you barely notice it as your thoughts circle around these Viking queens and their weapon of choice, marriage. You might think that forging a love match was their top priority, but love was rarely part of the deal. A queen's wedding was a battlefield without swords, where treaties were bound tighter than any ship's rigging. You feel the smoky air thicken as you imagine the tense hush of a wedding feast, where everyone waited to see if peace would really last through the night. Marriages in Viking society were never simple affairs. They were a living ledger, a tangled contract that knit entire families, villages, and even rival kingdoms together. You see her now, a young queen with saffron-colored sleeves, nodding solemnly as her father's lands gain new allies through her own future children. It sounds grim from a modern couch, but in those days, a woman's body was as much a tool of statecraft as any sword. Historians still argue whether these marriages felt like prisons or opportunities for queens to rise. A queen could leverage her husband's conquests into wealth and security for her people, or she might end up shackled to a violent brute whose only language was blood. But Viking women had surprising tools to protect themselves. Witness the morning gift, a chunk of silver or land set aside for her alone. A kind of insurance policy if things went sour. The mainstream fact is that this morning gift was a legal right, recognized across Viking lands, giving a woman leverage if her new spouse turned out to be less than heroic. A wife could even refuse to consummate a union until that gift was presented. Can you picture it? A line of warriors waiting to toast the couple, the queen folding her arms until the deal was fully signed and sealed and paid for. Some queens use these alliances to become true power brokers, reminding everyone at the feast that her children would inherit both sides of the family's legacy. You trace your finger along a battered wooden cup, wondering what it felt like to stand between two kingdoms with only your courage to keep you steady. There's a quirky tidbit here, too. Some wedding customs included hidden jokes or riddles that a bride had to solve before the marriage was finalized. Can you imagine that? You've just survived a 3-week journey on a bumpy cart. You're wearing 20 pounds of brooches and beads, and your in-laws decide to quiz you before giving you the keys to your new house. But these queens were sharp. They had to be. Marriage was their armor, and if they played it right, it was also their sword. You picture a bride stepping through a hall strewn with pine boughs, each footstep echoing like a promise. She might never love her husband, but she could still bend him to her will. After all, a queen who carried her family's honor on her shoulders didn't have the luxury of being shy. Sometimes these alliances crumbled, of course. Then the queen had to pivot, to gather what was left of her dowry and flee home. or even build a new network in a strange place. You sense how exhausting it must have been, balancing so many dangerous men while keeping your own ambition alive. The sagas barely tell those parts, but they are there. A flash of sarcasm in a skald's verse, a mention of a woman who returned with her father's sword, refusing to be anyone's pawn. Historians still argue whether these returns were celebrated acts of freedom or shameful failures. But you know deep down that it takes courage to walk away from a kingdom you once ruled, even if it means being called traitor or oathbreaker. The hearth crackles beside you, and you catch the scent of charred bread. Out in the night, somewhere past the carved gates, you hear a dog bark, a reminder of ordinary life pressing on, even in the shadow of royal maneuverings. These queens would have heard the same sounds, felt the same chill in the breeze, wondered if the next ship arriving meant peace or war. You lean back against the woven wall hanging, its wool threads scratchy, its dye a faded teal that once would have signaled wealth. It's easy to forget how many everyday choices depended on queens making the right match. If she married poorly, entire trade networks could collapse. If she married brilliantly, ships would sail under her children's banners for generations to come. In the flickering torchlight, you see a girl practicing the traditional marriage handclasp, maybe only 12 or 13, drilled in how to stand, how to smile, how to hold back tears. It's brutal, yes, but also a reminder that Viking queens had to grow up fast or be crushed. Tonight, though, you feel their courage all around you. Courage not of the sword, but of the mind, the heart, the quiet voice that could steer two angry jarls into an agreement rather than a slaughter. Queens were taught to read the air, to measure greed, to predict betrayal before the first blade was drawn. So you rest your cup on a rough bench, glancing at the dance of firelight on its rim, and think about how those women must have lain awake on their first married night, calculating how to twist their new husband's ambitions to suit their own. That, you suspect, was the true game, played in silk sheets instead of on a bloody field, and with that knowledge, you take a last sip of the mead and let the hall's whispers settle into your bones, ready to follow these queens wherever their alliances might lead you next. Your steps are steady now, drawn by the scent of smoke and honey from another fire. You sink down onto a bench near the hearth, letting the voices swirl around you, and the talk tonight is of battle, but not the kind you'd think. These Viking queens commanded power from the shadows, steering men's weapons without ever lifting a sword themselves. You can almost hear the hush in the hall as one queen rises to give orders while her husband is away at sea, her voice calm and sure, even as warriors shuffle their feet in grudging respect. Historians still argue whether these women truly ruled or merely acted as placeholders, but the sources hint that many queens had genuine power. You picture her, bright-eyed and iron-willed, issuing commands about food supplies, about the next tax shipment, about which cousin needed to be bribed to keep peace. She does it all while a baby tugs at the hem of her saffron dress. The mainstream fact here is that Viking queens served as regents, protecting their lands while husbands raided far beyond the horizon. These women controlled treasure chests, negotiated trade routes, and even handed out justice, which might be as small as resolving a sheep theft or as enormous as arranging a clan blood price. And then there were queens who went beyond mere survival. They innovated. A queen might set new standards for hospitality, insisting that all travelers, even enemies, be offered bread before a fight. Another might introduce fresh weaving patterns to mark her reign in cloth as well as law. You chuckle, thinking how a queen could make her mark with either a strong sword arm or a strong loom, both equally respected by those who knew how hard it was to build a household from scratch. In one half-forgotten tale, A queen was said to have banished every drunkard from her court for an entire summer, claiming they wasted mead and morale alike. That's your quirky tidbit. A queen basically running a dry camp for warriors, like a medieval AA program with a side of battle axes. You stretch out a bit on the bench, listening as a breeze flutters the smoke up toward the thatched roof. A young man is singing a love ballad about a queen who once paid her enemies ransom out of pity, only to see him turn on her later. That's the price of mercy sometimes. No good deed goes unpunished, even if you are a queen. You sense how these women had to walk a knife's edge, balancing generosity against suspicion. Too soft, and your kingdom fell. Too harsh, and your people revolted. It was a delicate dance, performed in long woolen gowns while men were away trying to become legends. A quick grin pulls at your lips as you imagine the men boasting around the fire of how they'd conquered a kingdom, never realizing their wives kept the grain stores full and the war horses shoed. Those queens managed things with a cunning so sharp it could have split oak, and still they found time to teach daughters how to weave and sons how to rule. The skalds, bless their rhyming hearts, usually forgot to mention that part. They'd carve sagas of swords flashing and shields breaking, but slip right past the daily grind of running a realm. You picture a queen balancing a ledger while planning a wedding feast, calming a tantrum from a toddler, and checking that the guards were sober on watch, all before sundown. Historians still argue whether these multitasking marvels should even be called queens, since the Norse word for queen sometimes just meant woman of the household. But you'd like to think that commanding warriors, running justice courts, and handling entire harvest negotiations earns the title. You watch the fire spit a bit of sap into the air, and you wonder what secret heartbreaks these queens carried. Children lost to sickness, lovers gone on a voyage who never returned, political rivals who smiled over dinner and then plotted a coup. The queen had to be part steel, part silk, woven together so tight that no blade could slip between. In some places, a queen was even expected to manage witchcraft, or at least to bless the seeress who did. That's another odd detail. A ruler's wife offering protection to the local sorceress, making sure the gods stayed happy and the omens stayed favorable. A queen might stand in the circle of rune casting, lips moving in a half prayer, half command, that no one dared interrupt. You can almost see the flicker of fear in the warrior's eyes when the queen nodded toward a witch, signaling whether to begin or delay a raid. Even the air seems to settle around you with that thought. The power of a woman who could hold men's lives in a single gesture. You sip from a clay mug, tasting cold water that carries the smoke of the fire, and think how no steel helmet ever protected a ruler quite like the loyalty of a woman who would kill for you, or refuse to kill if she so chose. The hush after the singer finishes echoes in your bones, and you breathe slowly, letting the knowledge sink in. Viking queens didn't need battlefields. They had their homes, their courts, their alliances, and sometimes even the power of the gods to keep everything from shattering. That was its own kind of war, one fought behind wooden walls instead of shield walls. And as you close your eyes to the warmth of the hearth, you can almost hear the quiet orders of a queen carried on the winter wind, a reminder that leadership is not always about who swings the hardest blow, but sometimes about who holds everything together until the storms pass. You shift on the bench, your legs a bit stiff from the long stories, and you stand to stretch. Out the doorway, the pale light of dawn has begun to slip through the cracks, reminding you that life went on whether you were ready for it or not. And that is precisely what many Viking queens understood better than anyone. Alliances were built in daylight, in market stalls, in whispered bargains carried by messengers who dared not lie to their queen. You step outside, boots scuffing across damp earth, and you picture a queen overseeing the trade ships, even if she herself never stepped onto the deck. She'd inspect cloth from the east, silver from far south, grain wagons coming in from nearby fields. She might count every measure of barley herself, eyes sharp as an osprey's, noting which traders tried to cheat. Historians still argue whether these queens had true economic power or were simply figureheads. But you sense from the records that at least some queens called every shot. They decided who could sell at the market, who owed taxes, who had the right to pass through a certain fjord. In a world where trade routes meant survival, that was a power sharper than any axe. Your mind wanders to a curious tidbit. One queen demanded a share of every bride price in her realm, like a wedding tax to fill her treasure chests. Seems a bit greedy at first, but then you realize that pot of silver helped feed orphans, fund repairs on war-damaged fences, and occasionally bribe a warlord who was getting too ambitious. Not the worst idea you've ever heard, right? You hear the low clatter of ox carts in your mind's eye, the chorus of haggling voices, the clink of coins on wooden counters. A queen moving through that swirl of people could gather more intelligence in a morning stroll than a spy might get in a month. Watching who complained, who carried new weapons, who grumbled about the harvest. That was the pulse of her kingdom, and if she needed to secure loyalty, a queen might arrange a festival. Viking festivals were not just excuses to get drunk, although plenty of ale did flow. They were the social glue, the place where alliances renewed, debts forgiven, and sometimes marriages arranged on a handshake. A wise queen knew how to plan a feast that balanced rival families across the benches, with just enough roast boar and mead to keep swords from being drawn. You picture her moving through the hall, sleeves bright with teal embroidery, stopping at each table to listen, to laugh, to keep a dagger of peace between men who would rather fight than sing. That was ruling too, not just taxes or land, but the human friction you had to soothe every single day. There's something quietly terrifying about that, you think. A Viking queen needed to be 1,000 things at once: mother, politician, judge, hostess, war strategist, occasionally a priestess, and always a peacekeeper. It was like juggling knives in a windstorm while trying not to trip over a child playing by your skirts. A breeze lifts a strand of your hair, and you imagine the queen's own hair pinned in elaborate coils, each braid a statement of power and wealth. Even her jewelry was a declaration, flashing silver brooches at her shoulders, a weighty necklace that made you pause before you spoke too boldly. In some rare cases, a queen was buried with enough silk, beads, and imported metal to shame a king. That's a mainstream fact you can bank on. The richest Viking female graves ever found, like Oseberg, belonged to high-status women who wielded enormous influence. Their ships were packed with everything from gaming boards to sleds, horses, cooking gear, and even a throne. Historians still argue whether these queens were viewed as living gods or simply women with money, but you suspect their power left a deep echo. The early sun seems to catch on your cheek, and you grin, thinking of one weird historical rumor. A queen was said to have outlawed onions in her household, claiming they made warriors smell unworthy of a good death. You have to chuckle at that, imagining a Viking huskarl being told, "No onions before battle, or the gods will frown." It's almost charmingly silly, and yet, in her halls, no one dared complain. As you wander away from the trading square in your mind, the queen's presence feels like a heartbeat that steadies the whole community. She'd settle disputes over weights and measures, break up fistfights between rowdy traders, even judge whether a man's debt was fair or rigged by some cousin trying to cheat him. In a world where men measure power by swords, a queen's word could change a life with just a glance. That's the subtle terror of her role. She could ruin you, save you, or simply ignore you, and you'd never know why. All the more reason to stay polite in front of her embroidered sleeves. You step a little further along the path, boots sinking into damp straw, and you see how each village felt that same pulse of queenly oversight. You might not glimpse her every day, but you felt her influence in trade prices, tax demands, festival invitations, and who showed up to collect a fine. It was a quiet power, an everyday reign that hid behind no shields yet bent entire warbands to her will. And that, you realize, is what made these Viking queens unforgettable. They ruled in the small things as fiercely as in the grand, stitching the social fabric so tightly that even the strongest raider dared not tear it apart. The queen was there, you sense, in every measure of barley, every bead of silver, every whisper of gossip that passed from one family to another. Like a spider at the center of a great web, ensuring that no part of her realm fell out of balance. That was her empire, and she ruled it with a smile as sharp as any blade. You continue on the path, drawn now toward the scent of wood smoke and the steady clanging of a forge. The life of a queen didn't stop at trade and gossip. Sometimes it burned hottest in the raw iron of power, quite literally. Viking queens might never swing a sword themselves, but their hands shaped which swords were swung, and by whom. You picture her stepping into a longhouse full of warriors, the kind who measured their worth by how many notches they had carved into their axe handles. But even these bruisers bent the knee to a woman whose command held their pay, their land grants, and their place in the world. Her word might spare their families if they fell, or grant them a plot of earth to build a future. It wasn't affection they showed, but respect, and maybe a touch of fear. Historians still argue whether Viking queens ever truly ordered men to war, but sagas hint they had more to do with raiding plans than they let on. A queen might press a husband or a brother toward a target, quietly promising him that spoils would patch up debts or cement alliances. Sometimes the war drums began with a whisper, a queen's voice stirring ambition like a poker in a hearth. There's a delightfully odd detail in one poem. It suggests a queen sharpened her husband's sword herself before he left for the battlefield, reciting charms so it would bite deeper. Whether that was folklore or fact, you can almost see her, sleeves rolled up, eyes shining with that fierce will to protect her family's power. And if you squint, you might even spot a sly grin as she mumbled, "Come back alive, but come back richer too." Passing a patch of wild mint, you breathe in sharply, reminded of another role queens played, preparing the mead and food for war feasts. There was a tradition that the woman of the household blessed the ale, and if she refused to serve it, the warriors took that as an omen that luck would fail them. So, if a queen lifted a golden horn in toast, you can bet those men felt braver, bolder, nearly unstoppable. Your boots crunch over a broken wagon wheel in your mind, and you can almost hear the clatter of an army forming, shields rattling, horses snorting, and the queen's voice cutting through the din to steady their hearts. The way a woman could turn the tide with a single blessing feels nearly magical, and maybe it was. Mainstream historians confirm Viking queens maintained networks of kinship far beyond their own homesteads. They kept messages flowing across rivers, fjords, and forests, building support among powerful cousins, allies, and distant chieftains. Like spider silk, that web could pull in warriors from a dozen settlements. No single man could match that reach alone. You pause to picture one royal hall where tapestries glowed with woven images of Thor and Freya, reminding everyone of the gods who watched them. A queen might stand there in the flickering torchlight, making sure each oath-swearing moment was witnessed by something older and greater than human law. If she nodded when you made a promise, that promise was sealed tighter than any wax. And then there were the disputes naturally. Who else would settle them if the men were busy smashing heads across the border? The queen stepped in to manage blood feuds, broker Vergild payments, and calm endless rivalries that could explode into vendettas. It was risky. A single wrong word could spark years of violence. But someone had to do it, and she did. Your mind snags on a wonderfully weird tidbit. One tale says a queen was so respected for judging feuds that people brought her stolen sheep to identify the rightful owner, and she was rarely wrong. Sheep court, if you will? You have to grin at the idea. All those grim warriors lined up for justice, over a missing lamb. Historians still argue whether these tales were inflated, praising women beyond their actual powers to soothe fragile egos. After all, a warrior might feel better telling people he took orders from a near mythical queen, rather than admitting he couldn't handle diplomacy alone. Yet the traces of land grants, trade privileges, and settlement treaties signed in a queen's name say a lot. She wasn't a puppet. She was a sovereign in her own right. You catch the sweet drift of smoke again and feel the pull of hearth fires waiting back at the royal hall. That hall, you realize, was more than a place to eat or sleep. It was the nerve center of the entire realm. It was where the queen decided who was worthy to sit closest to the high seat, whose gifts earned favor, whose insults deserved cold silence. Every feast was a performance, a balancing act. A queen had to manage which warriors could brag loudest, which merchants deserved to be praised, which neighbors needed to be subtly reminded that their taxes were due. It was politics served with roast venison, and you'd better believe she remembered every slight. The dawn air feels sharper now, making you draw your cloak tighter, and you sense how exhausting that role must have been. Always on guard, always listening, never letting her guard slip for even a moment. Yet these queens endured, year after year, shaping kingdoms without lifting a sword, but by lifting a voice strong enough to echo down the ages. And you keep stepping, drawn forward by that steady sense of power, an invisible current that flowed from a woman's mind straight into a kingdom's destiny. That's a power as real as any axe blade, and perhaps far more dangerous. You shift through the forest's hush, letting your thoughts trace the legacy of queens who didn't just rule households or herd warriors, but who quietly threaded together the threads of religion and ritual. Because here's something you might not expect. Queens in the Viking Age could wield as much spiritual authority as any godman, and sometimes more. Think about it. The queen was the one who kept the temple keys, sometimes even oversaw the great seasonal sacrifices, the blots. That's right, you can picture her with a bowl of blood in hand, solemnly sprinkling the carved wooden idols with a calm you'd envy. She kept the peace with the gods so the rest of the community could keep their peace with each other. Historians still argue whether these women were truly priestesses or simply noble sponsors of the ceremonies. But in practice, there wasn't much difference. When a queen commanded the offerings, no one dared call them improper. And if the gods favored the harvest that year, everyone knew who to thank, or who to blame if the mead ran sour. There's a delightful story from one medieval text where a queen was so respected in her role that warriors refused to eat a single bite before she blessed the food. Sounds like a logistical nightmare if she overslept, but also a testament to her power. As you ease into the rhythm of your footsteps, you picture the high seat pillars carved with images of Odin and Freya set to guard a queen's domain. Those pillars might even be named after family ancestors, reminding visitors that her clan's power was as old as the gods themselves. If you think modern politicians love to name drop, well, Viking queens did it with wooden columns. Some scholars argue that the role of the queen in rituals was actually a political strategy, giving her legitimacy beyond the fickle loyalties of warriors. Because let's face it, you can break a sword, but it's harder to break faith in the gods. And once a queen tied herself to divine favor, you'd need something bigger than a berserker to take her down. You duck under a low-hanging branch in your mind, imagining her voice carrying across the smoky temple hall, chanting charms to protect the land from sickness, wolves, or winter storms. People genuinely believe she had a connection, a hotline if you like, to powers that could shift the fate of everyone in the room. That's enough to make you wonder how much of her authority came from the crown, and how much from the awe in every worshipper's eyes. And those worshipers came in all flavors: farmers needing a good harvest, warriors begging for luck, mothers desperate to keep their children safe. A queen was expected to listen to them all with a steady face and an iron memory for promises. If she pledged a blessing, she had to deliver it, or the gods might be offended, and nobody wanted that heat. Here's one quirky detail. A poem from the Icelandic tradition describes a queen who could read dreams and predict the weather based on ravens circling the house. Whether she truly knew meteorology or just had a knack for observing storms on the horizon, she played her part well enough that even the local jarls took her word for gospel. Historians still argue whether these dream readings were private family skills passed down the female line or public rituals everyone witnessed. But either way, they gave queens an air of mystery you just couldn't buy with gold or silk. You can almost smell the warm hay where offerings were laid, the hiss of oil lamps guttering in the winter wind, and the way her cloak, probably dyed in deep indigo, swept across the rushes on the temple floor. A Viking queen wasn't a witch, but you wouldn't have blamed someone for whispering she had more than a bit of witchcraft about her. Think how that bled into everyday power. If you could interpret the gods' will, you could justify a bad harvest, a failed raid, or even an assassination attempt as divine punishment. No wonder the queen held so many keys. And those keys, sometimes actual keys to treasure chests, shrines, or storehouses, jingled as she walked. A subtle reminder that she was the keeper of the future. You ease your breathing, taking in the idea of all that weight on her shoulders. Every mistake might offend a god. Every prayer might land on deaf ears. And still she kept standing there, day after day, blessing new children, guiding old warriors, and making sure the settlement felt protected. That kind of spiritual labor leaves marks deeper than sword scars, don't you think? The dusk seems to settle around you, softening the path ahead, and you see how her role bound the entire community together. Without a queen's rituals, the social fabric might fray. Arguments could explode, neighbors might turn on each other, and raids might turn disastrous without divine favor. There's even a tale of a queen who refused to perform a ritual after being insulted by a rival clan, and within a season, her enemies lost their cattle to disease and blamed their own bad luck on offending her. It's practically a medieval mic drop. Your steps steady again, a reminder that these women's influence went far beyond grain storage or meal planning. They held the village's soul in their hands, shaping the story of who belonged, who was blessed, and who deserved to be remembered. So you keep moving, carrying that sense of quiet power with you, a soft echo of queens whose voices still linger in the hush of the north wind, promising that sometimes the mightiest magic is simply being believed. Your feet crunch gently on a gravel path in your mind as you follow the next thread. The role of queens as peacekeepers. And no, not the modern holding a press conference kind of peacekeepers. Think more along the lines of negotiating with blood-soaked warriors who just come home from hacking off half the countryside. Viking queens, whether they liked it or not, had to be experts at calming tempers and patching up family feuds. You can practically see them standing in a long hall after a feast, the smell of spilled ale and roasted lamb still hanging in the air, watching as cousins prepared to fight each other over a goat or a slight from last spring. That's when the queen stepped in, voice steady, maybe even amused, telling them to sit down before the gods decided to smite everyone with a plague. Historians still argue whether these interventions were truly respected or if warriors merely tolerated them out of courtesy. But let's be honest, sometimes the only force stronger than a Viking axe swing was a mother's disappointed stare, and queens, for better or worse, knew how to weaponize that look. There's a fascinating snippet of saga that claims a queen once kept an entire war from starting by inviting both rival sides to a feast and then refusing to serve any food until they signed a truce. No bread, no beer, no peace. A lesson as old as humanity. If only world leaders today had that kind of leverage. You shift in your thoughts, picturing her calm in the chaos, maybe wearing a saffron-dyed dress, gold brooches catching the torchlight, hair pinned with bone combs that smelled faintly of cedar. Even in the thick of a family meltdown, she'd hold her ground, reminding everyone that settlement politics didn't leave much room for reckless grudges. You know, these queens weren't passive wives. They acted more like community managers, negotiating bride prices, land settlements, and sometimes even the ownership of cattle and ships. Their authority over these matters didn't come from muscle or blades, but from respect, or at least a very practical fear of angering the woman who kept their clan running. One quirky tidbit. There's a tale of a queen who used to settle arguments by making each man retell the entire feud from start to finish, out loud, with no interruptions, so the whole hall had to listen to the world's most boring complaint in excruciating detail. By the time they got to the second retelling, nobody wanted to fight anymore. A brilliant stalling tactic, if you ask me. You keep walking through your thoughts, realizing these queens preserved more than peace. They preserved the future because constant blood feuds could wipe out a family line in a single generation. And when that happened, the gods wouldn't get their offerings, the fields wouldn't get enough hands, and the ships would lose their rowers. Everyone suffered. That's why you might catch a queen handing out wedding gifts to forge alliances, praising a rival's son to build goodwill, or even performing a sort of medieval PR campaign to smooth over last year's insults. It's almost funny how close it feels to modern politics. The same smiles, the same gentle threats, the same subtle reminders that, sure, you could go to war, but you'd regret it. Historians still argue whether their peacekeeping was genuine moral conviction or a simple survival tactic. After all, a burned-out settlement helped no one. But maybe it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the queen's job was to keep everyone alive long enough to fight the real enemies. Hunger, storms, plague, and of course that neighbor who kept trying to steal your goats. Picture it. A smoky hall in winter, tempers flaring, the queen calmly pouring mead for everyone, telling a story of some ancient hero who nearly destroyed everything because he refused to forgive. You almost hear the hall going quiet, all those grown warriors shifting awkwardly on their benches as the message lands. Sometimes the best stories are warnings. And if a warrior refused to listen, well, a queen had ways of making him listen. She might threaten to withhold resources, break up a marriage arrangement, or publicly shame him in front of the entire clan. For a Viking, losing face could be worse than a spear through the gut. So, yes, she had leverage, a lot of it. One fringe detail you might find amusing. A few medieval ballads talk about queens who trained birds, ravens, or even trained magpies, to help carry messages between settlements, a kind of Norse carrier pigeon system. Whether that's a total exaggeration or a hint at something real, you can bet a queen would use any tool to keep peace flowing. And when peace finally settled in, she could let the children sleep safe, let the traders do business, and maybe even let herself breathe for a moment. But you sense how temporary it always was. Vikings thrived on adventure, on the thrill of raiding, on the kind of bragging rights that peace rarely offered. So she had to be ready, again and again, to stitch their torn pride back together. You can almost feel the quiet dread in her bones, wondering when the next feud would flare. And yet, night after night, she'd keep the candles burning, keep the household steady, and keep reminding everyone that no matter how sharp their swords, it was still her hall, her rules, and her word that held them together. So, you take another step, letting the echo of her calm authority rest on your shoulders, seeing how her kind of power to soothe, was just as vital as any iron blade. Your thoughts drift toward another burden these forgotten queens carried, the burden of motherhood, in a world where sons were born to die. You picture the queen, still young by any modern standard, holding a squirming baby swaddled in linen, whispering soft blessings over its downy head. Maybe she tries to imagine a future for this child beyond steel and storms. But deep inside, she knows the odds. Viking boys were trained for battle practically from the cradle, and no mother's lullaby could protect them forever. The smell of smoke and salted fish drifts through the memory, the warmth of a hearth where older children squabble underfoot. You sense the queen's sharp eyes scanning them, already sorting who is quick of tongue, who is strong of arm, who might be too gentle to survive. Historians still argue whether these women truly resigned themselves to their sons' fates or fought to shape them differently, perhaps secretly teaching them mercy behind the warrior's back. And let's not forget the daughters. Viking daughters were no porcelain dolls. They learned to spin wool, brew ale, and guard the house in their father's absence. Yet their fate was often to be married off, sometimes as political hostages, sometimes as peacemakers. A queen had to stand watch over every offer of marriage, weighing alliances like a merchant weighing silver. One daughter placed in the wrong hall could collapse an entire treaty. You might wonder how a mother balanced affection with brutal strategy, but that was Viking life. One quirky tidbit suggests some queens tested suitors with riddles to weed out dull-minded or treacherous men, a sort of medieval dating IQ test. You can practically hear a queen's voice, calm and a little sly, asking a would-be son-in-law to name the 3 things stronger than iron, just to see if he had more brains than brawn. The queen's power as a mother was more than maternal. Her sons might owe her their first breath, but she also guided their first alliances, their first trade voyages, and even the first blades they were allowed to carry. And if one day that blade came back covered in someone else's blood, it was still her job to decide if vengeance or forgiveness would follow. A queen's love was fierce, but it was measured, like everything else in her world. You imagine her setting aside her own grief, maybe for a child lost to sickness or a husband killed in a faraway raid, because the clan could not afford a broken leader. The stories barely mention her tears, but you know they had to fall, perhaps alone by the hearth at night when the walls felt safest. Historians still argue whether Viking queens held more sway over their children than the men did, or if their influence was quietly suppressed as boys grew older. There is no single answer. You see hints, though, in the sagas, where a grown king still respects his mother's advice more than any warlords. Those half-hidden threads show how the woman who rocked the cradle might well have steered entire kingdoms. Picture a summer gathering. The clan comes together for trade, gossip, and a bit of matchmaking. The queen stands on the margins, scanning every handshake, every sly glance. Even as she shares a bowl of berries with the children, she is making mental notes, deciding whose gossip will blossom into scandal, whose ambition might one day turn dangerous. It's exhausting, but it's hers to manage. You get a sudden image of her mending a torn tunic, needle flashing in the firelight, while instructing a child on proper table manners. her voice calm, never harsh, but carrying an authority no warrior could easily break. In that sense, she raised Vikings not just with milk and songs, but with an iron sense of consequence. Respect the rules, or risk the gods' wrath, or worse, your mother's. One fringe rumor floats through medieval chronicles that some queens made secret offerings to the old goddesses for the safe return of their sons, even after Christianity had crept into the north. If true, it's a glimpse of a woman clinging to any scrap of hope, unwilling to leave her children's safety to one new god alone. Faith was layered, complicated, and for a mother, always desperate. You catch the hush of a winter night inside your thoughts, the queen stirring a pot of broth for sick children, while warriors argued outside over border raids. She would keep them warm, keep them breathing, keep them dreaming of something gentler than endless conquest. And even if no one ever wrote her name in a saga, the quiet might whisper it anyway, through every child who survived. Of course, the pressure to produce heirs was brutal. A queen without sons risked everything: lands, titles, even her own place in the hall. Some were cast aside, replaced, or worse. So those children sleeping in the straw beds were more than family. They were her shield against political oblivion. Harsh, yes, but true. You walk on through this memory, carrying a sense of awe for what these women managed, not just birthing warriors, but shaping them, teaching them the value of law, of loyalty, of thinking before swinging a sword. Their hands trained the men who would one day rule, for better or worse, and that is power no battle could match. Even if Viking poetry rarely sang their praises, you know those queens left fingerprints on every warrior's heart, an unspoken promise of home, a reason to keep coming back, and a fear of letting her down. That was the heart of Viking motherhood, the force holding together a world of ice, iron, and storm. Somewhere along the edges of that memory, you step into another layer of a queen's life, the realm of quiet diplomacy. You might think of queens as mere ornaments on a throne, but these Viking women were more like living chess masters, sliding pawns across a board made of alliances, rivalries, and vengeance. You picture one, tall and composed, wearing a gown the color of deep indigo, moving through a smoky feast hall. Every conversation is a thread, every smile a calculation. Historians still argue whether these queens truly commanded their own diplomatic missions or acted more as extensions of their husband's power. But you can sense the truth peeking through old chronicles. They were trusted advisors and political operators, shaping peace and war with words as sharp as any spear. When war threatened, a queen could carry messages no warrior would dare refuse. Her presence might cool a feud before it flared out of control, saving a generation of sons from dying in the mud. If a truce had to be sealed with a marriage, she weighed the worth of each potential bride or groom, ensuring loyalty would last longer than a single wedding feast. Her insight was often the difference between a brittle peace and a stable one. And let's not forget the subtle arts of hospitality. A Viking queen had to master the feast. You can almost hear the clatter of wooden trenchers, the splash of ale, the wary looks of rival chieftains, sizing each other up across a crowded table. The queen moved among them like a falcon watching for mice, pouring mead with a practiced grace, smoothing tempers before they boiled over. One wrong gesture could spark a blood feud, so her steady hand was the first and last defense. There's a quirky footnote here, a detail buried in a few half-forgotten sagas. Some queens kept personal jesters, not only to amuse guests, but to slip barbed jokes into the conversation, softening hard truths with a wink. Imagine a queen's quick glance, a sly signal, and a jester blurting out a mocking rhyme that made even a bitter rival laugh. That's medieval stand-up with a lethal edge. If a skald sang a poem that praised her husband too much, she might subtly correct the verse, reminding the hall that glory was never one man's alone. And if a young warrior bragged of reckless revenge, she could shame him with a single look, invoking a mother's wrath in public so that no man would back him. These small moments carried more power than any sword stroke. You see her again, during a tense treaty negotiation, handing out woven gifts, a fine cloak here, a silver brooch there, each one a carefully chosen symbol, not just pretty trinkets, but coded messages of rank, respect, and subtle threats. To refuse a queen's gift was to refuse her protection, and no sane chieftain risked that. Historians still argue whether these tokens came from the queen's own household or were provided by the clan, but either way, she knew exactly what each meant. The color of the thread, the weight of the silver, even the pattern of the embroidery, all spoke volumes in the silent language of power. Even religion entered her realm of soft persuasion. A Christian queen might use a cross as a sign of civilization, trying to calm a pagan warlord who feared new gods. A pagan queen, on the other hand, might invoke the blessing of Freya to win over a guest with lingering doubts about Christian ways. The faith on her lips was a tool, and a flexible one at that. One moment you imagine her arranging a tribute to Thor, blessing a captured sword to honor the old gods. The next, she is praising Christ before a visiting missionary. Was that hypocrisy? Maybe. Or maybe it was just ruthless survival. In a world where a careless word could ruin years of peace, a queen had to keep every option open. Picture her standing at the high seat, the winter wind rattling the hall's doors, all eyes on her as she announces that a blood debt has been paid. The feud ended, vengeance satisfied. You can sense the hush, the sudden collective relief, as men who might have killed each other instead bow their heads to her judgment. She controlled that moment, the pause between war and peace. No bard ever sang of it in quite the same way they sang of slaughter, but you can see how a queen's verdict became the fulcrum on which an entire clan balanced. There is something humbling about knowing these women walked a blade's edge their whole lives, negotiating with kindness in one hand and iron in the other. They could not afford to look away, not even for an hour. And if you ever doubt the strength of a Viking queen, remember this. The greatest kings of the age, men who burned villages and shattered armies, still relied on their mothers, wives, or sisters to hold their fragile worlds together. Without a queen's wisdom, no throne stood long. So you walk onward, carrying that knowledge like a secret, a quiet admiration for these women who spun peace from the raw wool of blood, bitterness, and betrayal. They built bridges with nothing but their voices and their eyes, their courage rarely carved in stone, but lasting in the memories of those they saved from ruin. A queen's diplomacy, you see, was not just about treaties or gifts or speeches. It was about keeping a broken world from collapsing completely, over and over again. If that isn't heroism, you wonder what is. And so, you come to the last steps of your path tonight, still guided by the quiet footprints of these forgotten Viking queens. You picture one final image, a queen growing older, her hair streaked with gray, her hands rough from years of spinning wool, and managing the affairs of a vast household. But there is steel in her posture, a kind of dignity no crown could bestow, because it was built from the countless battles she had fought behind closed doors. You see her rise before dawn, stirring the embers of a dying hearth, thinking ahead to a day of decisions. Who must be fed? Who must be judged? Which new rumor might need to be squashed before it turned into a feud? Her world was never only tapestries and fine jewelry. It was the entire survival of her people, riding on her every choice. Historians still argue whether these elder queens retained real power or were quietly pushed aside by ambitious sons and grandsons. But there are enough sagas, enough whispers in the corners of rune stones, to hint that many of these women kept their authority well into old age. They were trusted for their memory. No one else recalled as many debts, betrayals, or family curses, and in that memory lived their truest power. You can almost hear a grandmother's voice reminding a hot-headed chieftain of the terms of a peace bargain 20 winters ago, keeping him from breaking a promise in a drunken rage. She was the living ledger, the keeper of the tribe's long and tangled history. Now and then, a quirky tale pops up about these grandmothers. For example, one who carried a pouch of dried herbs, claiming it could ward off both fevers and bad luck. Or another who taught her granddaughters how to carve protection runes into combs, a superstition passed down like precious heirlooms. And you'd better believe they still argued about whether these charms actually worked. You walk with her through the last winter of her reign, noticing how each villager greets her with cautious respect, aware she has the authority to bless a marriage, to resolve a land dispute, or to disinherit a troublemaker. Her word is law, but somehow softer than a blade, more enduring than any warrior's fame. There's a quiet poetry in how a queen could age into the role of clan mother, still leading, still judging, until she was ready to let go. Even then, her name would echo in the minds of the living. Generations later, a child might still hear the old tales. She was the one who saved our village from ruin, or she was the one who made peace with the men across the river. That kind of legacy did not die. The stories say sometimes she would walk to the edge of a hilltop burial mound, speaking softly to the spirits of her ancestors. You imagine the wind whipping at her cloak, carrying prayers out to the old gods, or maybe to Christ. Because even at the end, she might hedge her bets, honoring every power that had helped her survive. Historians still argue whether these burial prayers were pure ritual or true expressions of faith, but the details matter less than the fierce devotion behind them. It was a final act of care, an unspoken promise that her family would be remembered, no matter what storms came next. And there is something beautifully human in that. After a life of steady vigilance, after a lifetime of balancing war and peace, love and loss, these queens still made time for tenderness, for a blessing over a sick grandchild, or a kind word to a worried servant. It was their way of stitching the world together, one moment at a time, refusing to let chaos win. Now you trace those footsteps with your own, taking in the hush of the night, the silence that falls when history itself seems to breathe. These queens did not swing swords on open fields, but they fought harder in 1,000 invisible battles, keeping everything from falling apart. That is the hidden power you carry with you, even now. One last spark of warmth hits you when you remember how their legacies live on, in modern family gatherings, in the way people still pass down stories, in the quiet strength of women who hold entire families together. You can see the echo of these Viking matriarchs in every mother who stands firm, every grandmother who commands a room without ever raising her voice. So, as the final embers fade, you feel a calm respect settling into your bones. It's a comfort knowing that through these queens, these fierce, protective, clever, complicated women, the Viking Age kept its humanity. They were the calm in the storm, the steady hand at the helm, the reminder that even in an age of blades and blood, there was room for compassion and reason. They are waiting there for you still, in the old stories and in the blood memory of everyone who needs their courage. You stand a moment longer, breathing in a sense of peace. There is nothing more to do tonight except let their names drift through your mind like a lullaby, an echo across centuries, as soothing as any hearth fire. Let the images grow soft around you now, the flickering lamplight, the distant echo of oaths, the quiet authority of a queen who no longer needs to shout to be heard. Let each breath you take sink a little deeper, as if you too are drawing calm from a centuries-old hearth. The world outside might still be wild and unpredictable, but inside these walls and inside this story, there is balance, there is care, there is a history that cannot be erased. You can feel how the hush of these queens' voices blends into the hush of your own thoughts, steadying your heartbeat. Their wisdom drifts through time to stand watch over you, reminding you that courage does not have to roar, that gentleness can be a shield, that the past still holds you in a quiet embrace. Maybe tomorrow you will face storms of your own, sharp words, heavy burdens, a world that sometimes forgets to be kind, but you will carry the memory of these queens with you, like a secret talisman hidden in your pocket. You will know that you do not have to rule with iron to be powerful, that your voice can be your legacy, just as theirs was. So rest now. Let go of the day, the worries, the noise, and slip beneath the soft weight of sleep, guarded by all those queens who stood before you, who will stand beside you if you ever need them. Their strength is yours tonight.